and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Lamentations chapter 3. So you got Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then Lamentations, if you're looking for references there. Not a book that gets read a lot.
I was reading it this morning.
I had a friend of mine that I used to travel with. That was her favorite book of all the books in the Bible. It was Jonah. Lamentations chapter 3. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations. Yes, that was a code word. If you were a Russian spy and you heard the word Lamentations, that was your code word to go into action. But that's a movie, so it doesn't have anything to do with us today.
What was in verse 1?
Chapter 3, verse 16 is where I'll start today. You know, one of the things about reading the Old Testament, and it's common, I think it's a common reaction to much of the Old Testament for us, and for some people who are believers, it's a common reaction to the New Testament, unfortunately. But we base discipleship on what I would call as a quid pro quo. Quid pro quo is simply pay as you go. In other words, if I stick a quarter in the vending machine, the quid pro quo is that whatever costs a quarter in the vending machine will come out. That's all it is. And a lot of people look at God like this. They go through their life. If I put in good things, God's going to send good things back my way. If I live rightly, my life is going to go smoothly. There's no argument that living rightly before God, life will go more smoothly than it would otherwise, but not necessarily in the practical areas that we think of when we think about a life going more smoothly. So if discipleship is based upon seeking the least troublesome consequence in life, then what does discipleship even mean? Let's take a look at this text and let Jeremiah speak into that for us. I'll begin reading in verse 16. God ground my teeth in the gravel. He trampled me in the dust. I'm deprived of peace, and I have forgotten what happiness is. So I said, my endurance has expired. I've lost all hope for deliverance from the Lord. Remember my impoverished and homeless condition, which is a bitter poison. And I continually think about this and am depressed. But I call this to mind. Therefore I have hope. The Lord's loyal kindness never ceases. His compassions never end. They are fresh every morning. Your faithfulness is abundant. My portion is the Lord, and I have said to myself, I will put my hope in Him. Jeremiah, now if you know the back history of this particular passage, it's a very deep back history, and it explains a lot by what he's saying here. Of course, you know that Jeremiah was thrown into a hole because of his prophecies about the bad things that were going to happen in Judah relative to the Babylonian captivity, which was coming. He prophesied it. Isaiah prophesied it. It was prophesied to the Jews for about 100 years before the Babylonian captivity actually came. We're in a period of around 608 to 538 BC. This is post-Babylonians' arrival in Judah. They have already come. They have deported a good number of Jews back to Babylon. They have imported a good number of Babylonians into Judah. It's all, the temple has been destroyed. The walls have been torn down. There was a year-long siege that was previous to this, wherein the king had many opportunities to surrender. And Jeremiah, if you go read Jeremiah's prophecies, he begged them to surrender to the Babylonians because this is God's judgment. If you'll just surrender to them, they won't have to tear down the walls. They won't have to destroy the temple. But the king knew better, and he said, no, I'm going to hold out. And of course, the Babylonians did come, and they did everything they said they were going to do, put many people to death by the sword. It was a terrible time. The temple was destroyed in 586 BC, and there was another deportation that took place. Now, there's a bit of confusion biblically here within scholarship as to how many actually were deported. Jeremiah says that 4,600 were deported. 2 Kings reports 8,000. Why the discrepancy? The discrepancy is thought by most scholars, and I think this makes good sense. It's a 900-mile journey between Judah and Babylon. So imagine yourself healthy, young, in chains, being marched 900 miles. The people who are marching, you really don't care whether you're thirsty, hungry, or anything else. They think, most scholarship thinks 3,400 of them died on the way, which explains the discrepancy in the numbers. The distinction is probably just that this terrible journey of 900 miles as a captive, they just lost that many lives. The captivity lasted for 70 years, roughly, within just a year or two of that, depending upon who makes the recorded period of time. And it was ended by the conquest of the king of Persia, Cyrus, who Isaiah names by name 140 years before Cyrus was on the earth. Pretty remarkable prophecy. The captivity came just as Isaiah and all those who'd prophesied before happened. Everything happened just as they said, and it was all due to Israel and Judah's apostasy and idolatry. They had just adapted all of the practices and religious worship of the Arabs that were around them, and God warned them for 100 years. Now, this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't happen overnight. 100 years is a long time. I mean, that's 3 generations roughly in the Bible's terms of people that came and went, and each time they were warned. We look at what's going on in our country right now and think about it now. We are 2 generations removed from Vietnam. That's a lot of people that, for them, for my son, 9/11 is something in a history book. I mean, he's seen some documentaries, but he was 2 years old. He doesn't really think about 9/11 like you and I do at all. For him, the most recent events are Afghanistan. Well, there are people being born right now. For them, Afghanistan is just going to be something to read about in a history book. So what I'm getting at is, Israel was warned for 100 years, but these generations come and go, and life just seems to go on just like it seems to be going on for us. Hey, everything looks all right to me. My refrigerator's full. I'm eating. And back then, it would be, my flocks are doing okay. My family's doing okay. My farm's doing okay. What's to worry about? Well, the history book may, as one poet has said, God's millstone of justice grinds slowly, but it grinds exceedingly finely. And it does. So the time of captivity, now what was that like? Well, it's not what we picture. We picture a lot of, and I've heard this preached this way, the terrible captivity of the Jews by Babylon. But it wasn't terrible. It was not terrible at all. When Babylon came, that was terrible. When they destroyed everything in Judah, that was terrible. When they destroyed the northern kingdom, they'd already done that. That was terrible. They deported a lot of people and imported a lot of Babylonians back into Judah and the northern kingdom. That was terrible. But life went on. Life went on. As a matter of fact, they were essentially free, just as free as they had been when there was no Babylon in the area. They were just living their lives as Jewish families, and they were growing their crops, and they were farming, and they were selling, and whatever they did just kept going. The commerce kept going. I mean, 8,000 people is a lot of people, but that's not that many compared to the whole population, right? It's terrible if it's you, or it's terrible if it's your daughter, son, wife, or husband, or uncle or aunt, but it's not terrible for the whole nation. Kind of like our country, right? Terrible things happen to those trapped in Afghanistan, but my refrigerator's still got food in it. So there's a lot here to consider. The picture of captivity, I've heard it preached this way, was they liken it to Auschwitz. Well, it wasn't like that. The nation went on. As a matter of fact, the people in Judah and the northern kingdom had Babylonian military protection, just like they did in Jesus' time with the Romans. If someone had attacked Judah from the outside, the Philistines or whoever was in the region at the time, Babylon would have defended the territory. Why? It's their territory now. So it's just, they could develop businesses, and many, many Jews historically grew very wealthy, both in Judah, the northern kingdom, and the Jews that were back in Babylon. They built lives. They built lives so well that the Jews in Babylon were sending resources, money, back to Jerusalem. That's how well they were doing in Babylon. And when Cyrus, the liberator, the Persian liberator came, he set them free. He said, you can go back to your land. All is well. You can go back and build the walls. A pile of the Jews said, why would we go back there? We've got this great life we've built here in Babylon. We'll just stay where we are. And they did. Lots of them refused to go back. So herein, for me, lies a clue to human nature. A really deep clue that I think says a lot to us relative to this text. When human beings are stressed to the limits, we tend to just make the best of it. That's what we do. And the adaptability and the way that we do make the best of it makes us forget why all this might have been brought on anyway. So for the Jews, they forgot. All of the Jews at this time in history were not lamenting the fact that they had been conquered at all. It was a small number of them. Those who were close to the Lord, who wanted to see the worship of the Lord, who wanted to see the nation be God's people, they were lamenting the fact. Lamentations like Jeremiah. But most of the people were not. They were just living their lives. As my son used to say when he'd come on Wednesday nights and we'd get into a conversation about something we had studied on Wednesday night, he'd say, Dad, I just think most people are just trying to live their lives. We lament those who we might talk to who don't know Jesus. We lament that fact. They're not lamenting. They're not lamenting anything about that. They're just living their lives, just like the Jews did. And the adaptability causes us, as it did them, to forget why this judgment even came. All these generations come and go. They don't have a clue what's going on. Babylon? I don't even remember Babylon. Who are Babylon? And then Cyrus comes and liberates them, and their lives just go on like nothing has happened. You have to realize that these events, though they're terrible, they're only terrible for a few. That's remarkable to me. As I looked at the history of this captivity, it's one of the most significant periods of Jewish history that they still write and talk about today. But for most of the nation, nothing really happened. Now we view it, we look at the Old Testament, we say, well, here's what we're learning from the Old Testament. The Jews are up here, they're living well before the Lord, God's blessing them, just like in Deuteronomy chapter 6, 7, and 8. And then they slide toward apostasy, and God brings some kind of judgment, another nation, and they go through the judgment, terrible things happen, and then they wake up and they go back and they start following God again. We see this cycle up and down, sin, judgment, clean, sin, judgment, clean, sin, and it just goes on, and we think, well, that's what we're supposed to learn. That's only a little bit of what we're learning. It's a lot messier than that. A lot messier. A lot more happens than just this little cycle. So what does this speak to us today? Well, I think in our life, most of the time, some of the time at least, we mistake the things that come into our life as being part of that same cycle of sin, punishment, judgment, and then we're back to cleaning up and coming before the Lord. My tire went flat on the way to the mall or on the way to Walmart. God's judging me. Not necessarily. Now look, I want to be very careful here. I would never say to somebody, because I don't know, that God is not allowing something to teach us. The letter to the Hebrews says God disciplines his children. I have no doubt about that. But to ask me to identify the difference between just stuff that happens in a fallen world and God bringing judgment, don't ask me about that, because I don't have a clue. And I remember people they start to, now think about it in your own mind, and if this isn't you, forget about the whole thing, but we tend to start viewing God as a kind of a machine that's got nectar and a whip. Nectar and a whip. Plug in the wrong thing and out comes the whip. Plug in the right things and out come the nectars. And we think about God that way. And I can tell you in my correspondences and in meeting with people here in Manor, there are a lot of people who look at God just like that who don't believe in Him. He's a machine with nectar and a whip. God's a person. He's a person. Now, there are so many factors that can strip away His personhood. One of them is that. The other is the universe. The physical universe. We see the laws working out, right? If I climb up onto the water tower there in Waycross and decide, you know what? I believe if I jump over the handrail, I'll just float in midair. I'll find out right quick that gravity is going to work and I'm going to hit the ground. And that's just the way it is. The seasons change, the plants grow, everything just seems to move along like a machine. That teaches us, whether we're thinking about it or not, that that's the way the universe actually is. It just works. And it does. And consequences flow. I remember reading this one philosopher that said, your belief in the real world is exactly correlative with how fast you will drive your car toward a fixed concrete object. That's how much you believe the real world actually is. How fast you will actually drive your car toward a fixed concrete object. Whether or not a consequence is a supernatural moment where God is using something of this fixed universe to teach us, I don't know. I don't know. Now think about it this way. What if the universe was machine-like in that way, but it was like the time on Sinai, when they were gathered at the foot of Sinai, and Moses was up there, and the light show and the thunder and the lightning, everything was going on. He was getting the instructions from God, and they were scared to death. They wouldn't even touch the mountain. And they were told, if you come near it, you'll die. Oh, well, that's good enough for me. I'm not coming anywhere near it. And there was almost this, as you watch them travel through the wilderness, there's almost this kind of situation where it's like our dogs at home with a shock collar on. You know, our dogs are in the yard, and if somebody comes by walking their dogs, our dogs go nuts. I mean, they want that dog so bad. And they run right around the perimeter, barking and scratching the dirt, and bark and scratch the dirt till they get to the stop spot where the fence is, where they know they'll get shocked, and they stop there, and then they just stand there and look. If God worked like that, I mean, everything would be really clear, wouldn't it? We could just move about. Oh, I shouldn't have done that because I get the jolt. Oh, but I got that. I got the nectar. That must be a good thing that I'm supposed to do. Obedience and reward, disobedience and pain. Well, if the universe was like that, what would it mean to say I'm a disciple? It wouldn't mean anything at all. The dogs aren't disciples. They don't obey that shock collar fence because they love Becky and me. They're not running around the yard thinking how much they love us and we're going to obey the fence. They obey it because it hurts if they don't. This is one of the appeals of Islam. Islam tells you how to put your pants on, whether you should do it standing or sitting. I mean, all kinds of rules. And people like that because it makes life really simple. Allah will bless this, Allah will curse that. And you go through your life like that. That's not a disciple. That is not a disciple. It eliminates the disciple as a category. There's no category for somebody who's simply obeying the consequences. Think about it this way. Who is it that said of Job, stop and think, he's only good because you've put a hedge around him? Who said that? Satan. And Job proved him wrong. The gift giver came to Job and took all the gifts away. And Job still believed in the gift giver. He still hung on. See, if this is the way the universe is, then the deep satisfaction that comes from living for the Lord, part of what we get as the peace that passes all understanding is a deep satisfaction because we're trying to be disciples. And if it's just a stimulus-response relationship, nectar or a whip, there's no reason to consider any kind of sense of reward for obedience. It's going to be, just like most of the atheists with whom I correspond, he'll crack me across the head if I don't obey. What about a different universe where all the negative consequences are removed? from the universe. Let's just say that God has decided to make the universe a nice place. So when the person comes into your home with a gun to rob you and they pull the trigger, little dandelion seeds come out, and float off to the end of the gun. That's what God does. He turns the bullets into dandelion seeds. Or somebody comes up to you to hit you with a pipe, he turns it into a foam pool noodle every time that happens. Pretty soon there are just no consequences. Well, what would it mean to say agape love in a universe like that? Wouldn't mean anything at all, because agape love is costly. And if there are no consequences, if it doesn't hurt me to love somebody who doesn't deserve to be loved, then there's no such thing as agape love at all. It's easy. He's going to come at me with the pipe and it's going to turn into a foam noodle. I know I'm going to be all right. Doesn't cost a thing. See, here's what it boils down to for every human being on this earth, and it has always boiled down to this. We want heaven on earth, and we want it on our terms. That's all. That's all it is. We want all God. This is what the Jews wanted. This is why they kept sliding into apostasy like this. And God was so merciful, 100 years of sending the prophets, and they would not listen. They want all of God's blessings without the God. That's all it is. That's all it's ever been. But why is it that God seems to work this way? I'll tell you why. Because God is just like an artist. Look at the creation and tell me that God's not an artist. He is. And we're part of that. So it's like God is pouring over us as part of his artistic expression to refine us into the piece of art he sees each one of us to be. I remember reading about this painter who was a member of a big family, famous painter, at his family's house for Thanksgiving. He was a man. And the man comes, and the little girl, 4 years old, comes up and says, "Would you draw me a horsey?" And so he whips out a sheet of paper and he sketches a horse right quick, hands it to her. She's just delighted. But that's very different than what he does when he goes back to the studio and pours over a painting, or a woman who's a sculptor pours over a sculpture. It's almost like if the piece of art could talk, it would say, "Stop, you're hurting me." But the sculptor wants the art to be refined and perfected as far as it can be. That's agape love. That's what love looks like. That's what God's love looks like. I remember hearing Clint Black, one of the few country artists, not just a hunk in a hat or a supermodel that can sing, but somebody that writes their own material. And he says this in one of his songs. We wrote it to his wife after they'd been married for about 10 years. And it says, "Love is not somewhere we fall. Love is something we do." I thought, wow, what a profound statement. You know, think about it like this. I don't know if that piano's on. It is. Think about this. If you take these two notes, let's see. Yeah. That's dissonant, right? It doesn't sound very good. But then if you do this, it sounds a little better. Take some of the edge off, but then if you do this, it takes the dissonance out and it resolves. That's kind of like, well, thank you. It's only because I've not studied enough to read music well enough to do that, not much more. But this tension and release is part of God's work. The tension of the Babylonian captivity and all that was entailed was part of God's work, not to hurt the Jews, but to refine them into what he saw them to be. They are his artistry. You and I are his artistry. The universe is just a stained painting and a faulty mechanism, and we happen to live in it. I remember this movie. This won't make any sense to anybody but those of you who have seen this movie, called WALL-E. It's one of those new Pixar movies where it's a cartoon, but the cartoons almost look real. You know, they've used computers to generate them. I forget when these movies first started coming out, it cost $100,000 a minute to generate these films because it just took that much work. Now it's a lot cheaper. But in WALL-E, here's the story. The whole human race is on a spaceship going somewhere. There's a spaceship big enough to hold all of humanity, and they're all on it. They've been on it for 100 years, 200 years. and the earth is unlivable. But occasionally this spaceship will send a robot back to Earth to check it to see if it's habitable once again. And the way they check it is they've got this one little sprout in the big ship, one green sprout, that if it's growing, it tells them they could go back. But the people in the ship, they ride in these chairs where they sit like this. It's like a big lazy boy, and they're floating about in these lazy boys. They don't have to do anything. If they're thirsty, this arm comes up with a drink and a straw and sticks it in their mouth. They drink from it and it goes back. And if they're hungry, the arms come up and feed them food for a few minutes until they're not hungry, and then it puts it all back. And they just go around. They never have to get out of those chairs to do anything. Now, there are questions I had about that, but I'll leave those for another time. But what's happened to the people? They're all shaped like babies. You know, they just got the rolls coming down their arms, around their cheeks. Everything's round. And at one point, the captain of the ship has to get out of the chair to save the world. And he can't even walk. Because he's been generations in the chairs. They've never known anything. God doesn't want that. That's why the universe remains as it is. That's why we don't just poof off into heaven right after we're born again. God is building you and me into people fitted for heaven. He's planted in us a yearning for heaven. And you know, you talk to a 25-year-old, they don't have that. 16 years old, they don't have that yearning for heaven. He's building us into what he sees us to be. And, you know, trying to figure out how God works in terms of what's going on in our lives and whether or not that's punishment and reward is just perfectly silly. You know what we're supposed to do? Is embrace the world as it comes to us and take all the things that do come to us and see them for what they are. The things that God is allowing in our lives to build us into the artwork that he sees us to be. That's hard to do. That's hard to do because some things, like the sculptures sculpting, the sculptor would cry out and say, that hurts. Could you just stop for a while? I felt that way. But boy, what a great thing it would be as if more and more we could learn to embrace the things that come as God's work in us to make us who he wants us to be. I need to do that. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I